Hey guys, I want to do a quick video just showing how I touch up a knife. This would be freehand sharpening. This knife isn't like super dull. It's Phil Wilson Bird and Trout. Been using it quite a bit in the kitchen. I did some light wood carving, like whittling with it to see how the edge held up. Did really well. Actually, the only time the edge suffered was in the kitchen. And I think it was I used a harder cutting board, which I need to get a proper cutting board, and I knew it wasn't a good one. So I think a couple spots. And the tip, you can see, isn't wanting to really catch paper much. The back isn't too bad. Oops, but it still has some snags and doesn't have a lot of the aggression. One of the main advantages, though, of it, goodness, if I can hold on to anything, with the thinness of the geometry, is the geometry can continue to cut for a very, very long time, even when the actual apex is maybe rolled down or flattened some. That's just the same principle physics of like a wedge. The thinner the wedge is, the easier it's going to keep going into material, and the thicker one is, the more force it's going to take. Sharpening thinner edges is also easier, mainly because you're not going to have to guess your angle as much. At least it'll be easier to tell if you're hitting the edge. You'll get better feel for it and listening if you're kind of newer to freehand sharpening. Versus, say, like the CT, which is nearly 3 to 4 times thicker behind the edge than this knife. You have that much wider bevel, and so it can be harder to gauge if you're actually hitting the apex. This is why a lot of people will use a Sharpie marker to help see if they're getting that very, very last little bit. And another deceptive problem that I had, and if you haven't experienced it, that can really trip you up, is sometimes with a thicker edge like this, when you are doing freehand, you might sometimes raise your angle up a little bit and run a stroke on the stone, and it'll start to cause like a burr formation because you're hitting the apex, but it's not really clean, and that apex isn't meeting up with the primary bevel, and so you end up kind of with an edge that doesn't really stick. It's just kind of raised a wire edge, and at least I think that's what's going on. It won't actually be very sharp if you were to cut that off and try and sharpen again on your primary bevel, because it actually isn't meeting there at the apex. It's kind of above it. So anyway, the first thing I'm going to do, this might be a little hard. I think I can keep my angles pretty good. I'm going to do a couple elevated passes really light. This is just that cheap diamond stone. And the elevated passes are going to be to remove any weakened metal. Also, I'm going to avoid raising a burr as much as possible. But the hard thing for me to explain how you do that when you're sharpening, since that's what you always hear to do. As you sharpen more, you'll see me check the edge a lot, and I can kind of tell by how it's wanting to catch my skin, how it feels if it's properly forming. So I'm just doing some real light passes. I'm not using much pressure. Keeping a relatively low angle. I think it's around 10 degrees on this knife. Check it right now. Yeah, it's already regained. The tip still isn't quite, but it's already regained a lot of the slicing aggression. This is why a lot of the modern folders, like the 0620 right over here, I mean, fit and finish on all of that is absolutely impeccable. I mean, for me, it's almost like, how do you justify a knife that's $600 by much? Because there's nothing wrong with it other than I don't like geometry. That's problematic. It doesn't cut very well. Let me... There's all this stuff dropping off. You can see now that it's... Even on... I don't know if I can really get a push cut. maybe. It's going to be close to... Can't really get a push cut. This is a pretty coarse diamond edge, but you can see its slicing aggression is really high now. And I will check it both ways to make sure the edge is pretty well formed. Okay, so we got good slicing aggression now. What I'm going to do is one more elevated pass, extremely light. This is again to get rid of any weakened metal that may have formed, like if I did have a burr so small you can't see it. A burr is inevitable on a microscopic scale essentially, but it's the sharpening and the process of refining that to where it's essentially negligible once you start cutting. If you have a really big burr at the edge, what happens is it's no different than if you took a piece of metal and kept bending it back and forth and then tried to leave it straight and then put pressure. It's just going to snap off. It's the same thing that's happening at your apex. The metal's weakened and it just wants to snap. And then you're left with essentially that dull edge again. Okay, so now we're going over just to the fine side. Gonna do again an elevated pass really lightly for the grit reset. This sharpening process I got through Cliff Stamp, who I believe got from Joe Talmadge. It's not as commonly heard because I'm not even going to strop. I'm just going to do a couple more passes on this fine. And I'm not putting any pressure because the diamond's cut without... Well, and the other problem is that too much pressure can tear the stones out of the binder. Okay, it's probably pretty good now. Yeah, the entire edge is very sticky. Alright, so what I'm going to do is one more extremely light elevated pass, like barely even the pressure of the blade. Oops. And then I'm going to cross the grain, so I'm going to cross the scratch pattern. This is again to try and... This process I don't fully understand as much, but again, what I understand it is to, again, try and remove any weakened steel. We're trying to keep the apex as crisp as we can. And I'm just going to do a couple final light passes. And again, these aren't like push cuts. This grit is pretty low, but I might be able to get a bit of a push cut. It's definitely not wanting too much. The edge isn't very finely polished. Even the slice cutting, though, it's very deceptive because you don't have to do... I mean, this edge is so thin, even when it was dull, I could still slice cut. But it's very sharp now, and this is still a pretty coarse grit, really. So it's, push cuts aren't going to be the easiest. I don't think. I really can't get one started. Not so bad. I was pulling the paper into it. So anyway, that's just how I do a touch-up, and you can see the edge is quite sharp now. It wasn't super bad to begin with. I have another one that's really bad that I'll need to do more work on, but if you have any questions, comments, feel free to ask or just comment, and I will see you guys in the next video.